On September 19, 1993, at 2:47 in the afternoon, Harlan Voss was running his Case IH 1680 axial flow through the southeast corner of his leased section when he heard the feeder house chain skip once, catch, skip again, and then break with the flat metallic sound of something that has been wearing toward failure for longer than anyone noticed. He shut down immediately. The corn head stopped mid-row. Harlan climbed down from the cab and opened the feeder house panel and saw what he already knew he would see. The chain had snapped at a worn link, and the drive sprocket had chewed through two more links trying to keep tension. The chain was gone, the sprocket was damaged, the harvest was stopped. Harlan was 61 years old. He had been farming since 1954, the year after he graduated from high school in Fremont, Nebraska. He farmed 880 acres, 280 of which he owned outright, and 600 of which he leased from a retired dentist named Gordon Klemp, who lived in Omaha and had inherited the land from his father in 1981. Harlan had been leasing that 600 acres since 1982 at $72 per acre, a rate that had stayed fixed for 11 years because Gordon didn't pay attention to farmland values and Harlan didn't bring it up. The lease renewed every December. It was September. Harlan had 4 more days of combining ahead of him if nothing went wrong. Something had gone wrong. He drove to Elkhorn Implement, the Case IH dealer 14 miles south of his farm, and walked into the parts department at 4:18 in the afternoon. The parts manager was a man named Dennis Roth, who had worked at Elkhorn since 1979. Harlan told him what he needed: a feeder house chain assembly for a 1680 and a new drive sprocket. Dennis looked it up in the system. The chain was in stock at the regional warehouse in Grand Island, 90 miles west. The sprocket was not. Dennis said he could have the chain by morning and the sprocket by the end of the week. Harlan asked what the end of the week meant. Dennis said Friday, maybe Saturday. Harlan said he needed both parts now. Dennis said the sprocket was on national back order. Harlan asked how long. Dennis said he didn't know. Harlan stood at the parts counter for a long time. Then he said, "Order them both. Call me when they come in." He drove home. The combine sat in the equipment shed with 320 acres of corn still standing in fields that had been dry for 3 weeks and were supposed to stay dry for another week, according to the forecast he'd checked that morning on the radio. The weather was holding. Harlan told himself the weather would keep holding. If you understand what it means to farm on leased ground, to watch a harvest window narrow while a part sits on back order, and to carry the weight of a decision that will either prove itself or prove you wrong based entirely on whether the rain comes before the part does, then you understand why this channel exists. We preserve the stories that only reveal their full cost across decades. The ones where the consequence arrives so slowly that no one connects it to the original decision until it's too late to make a different choice. If that matters to you, consider subscribing. These stories are not loud. They are not fast. They are just true. Now back to September 1993 and Harlan Voss and a feeder house chain that was supposed to arrive by Saturday. Harlan Voss had been raised on a 160-acre farm north of Fremont by a father who believed in cash transactions and distrust of debt. His father had bought the land in 1938 with money saved from working railroad construction crews during the Depression. He farmed it without borrowing. He bought used equipment. He traded labor with neighbors instead of hiring help. He paid cash for seed and fertilizer, or he didn't plant. When Harlan graduated from high school in 1953, his father told him he could farm the 160 acres on shares or he could leave. Harlan stayed. He married a woman named Eleanor in 1955. They had 2 daughters. He worked the 160 acres on a 50-50 split with his father until 1967, when his father had a stroke and couldn't work anymore. Harlan bought the land from his father for $42,000, financed over 15 years at 6.2% interest. He paid it off in 1979, 2 years early. In 1973, Harlan bought an adjoining 120 acres from a neighbor who was retiring. He paid $67,000, financed over 10 years. He paid that off in 1982, 1 year early. Harlan did not expand after that. He did not believe in leveraging equity to buy more ground. He believed in owning what he farmed and farming what he owned. But 280 acres was not enough to support a family and cover the rising costs of seed, chemicals, fuel, and equipment. So in 1982, when Gordon Klemp's father died, and Gordon inherited 600 acres that he had no interest in farming himself, Harlan leased it. The lease was simple, $72 per acre, paid every December, renewable annually, unless either party gave 60 days' notice. Harlan treated the leased ground the same way he treated his own. He maintained the fences. He cleared the drainage ditches. He didn't mine the soil. Gordon renewed the lease every year without negotiation. The rate stayed at $72 for 11 years because Gordon lived in Omaha and didn't follow farm landmarks, and Harlan wasn't going to suggest that Gordon raise the rent. By 1993, farmland lease rates in Dodge County, Nebraska had climbed to an average of $94 per acre. Harlan was paying $22 per acre below market, which saved him $13,200 per year. That savings was the margin that kept the operation viable. Without the leased 600 acres, Harlan couldn't justify the cost of the equipment. Without the below-market lease rate, the 600 acres didn't generate enough profit to make leasing them worth the risk. The arrangement worked because Gordon didn't pay attention and Harlan didn't make mistakes. On September 20th, Dennis Roth called at 7:30 in the morning and said the feeder house chain had arrived. Harlan drove to Elkhorn Implement and picked it up. He asked about the sprocket. Dennis said it was still on back order, no estimated arrival date. Harlan asked if there was another Case IH dealer within 100 miles that might have one in stock. Dennis called 3 dealers. None of them had the part. Harlan asked if a used sprocket from a salvage yard would work. Dennis said it might, but there was no guarantee a salvage sprocket wouldn't be as worn as the one Harlan had just broken. Harlan asked what Dennis recommended. Dennis said, wait for the part. Harlan drove home with the feeder house chain and no sprocket and a combine that couldn't run without both. The weather held through September 21st, 22nd, and 23rd. Harlan installed the new feeder house chain. He greased the combine, he checked the oil, he cleaned the cab. He did everything except start the engine, because starting the engine without the sprocket would just remind him that the combine couldn't combine. On September 24th, Dennis called and said the sprocket had shipped from the warehouse and would arrive Monday, September 27th. Harlan said thank you and hung up. It was Friday. He had lost 5 days. The forecast still showed clear skies through the weekend and into the following week. Harlan told himself Monday was acceptable. On September 25th, the wind started. It came out of the northwest at 15 miles per hour in the morning and built to 25 miles per hour by afternoon. Harlan stood in his driveway and watched the standing corn in the field across the road bend and sway and then snap back upright when the gusts passed. The stalks were dry. The ears were heavy. The wind was testing them. On September 26th, the wind continued at 20 to 30 miles per hour with gusts to 40. Harlan walked the southeast section, the one he'd been combining when the chain broke. 20 acres of corn had started to lodge, leaning at angles that would make it difficult to pick up with the head set at normal height. He walked back to the house and called the National Weather Service recording. The forecast said the wind would diminish Monday and clear skies would continue through Wednesday. Harlan went to bed that night, believing the worst was over. On September 27th, it rained. Not a lot, just enough. A quarter inch overnight, then another half inch by noon, then steady drizzle through the afternoon. The wind kept blowing. By evening, the standing corn in the southeast section had gone from 20 acres of light lodging to 140 acres of severe lodging, stalks bent parallel to the ground, ears resting in mud. Harlan stood at the kitchen window and watched it happen. Eleanor asked if the part had come in. Harlan said he didn't know. He hadn't called. He called Dennis Roth at 7:15 on the morning of September 28th. Dennis said the sprocket had arrived Monday afternoon as scheduled. Harlan drove to Elkhorn Implement, picked up the sprocket, drove home, installed it in the feeder house, and had the combine running by 10:30 a.m. The rain had stopped. The wind had dropped to 10 miles per hour. The fields were too wet to combine. Harlan waited. On September 29th, the ground was still too wet. On September 30th, the surface had dried enough to risk it. Harlan started combining the fields that hadn't lodged. He worked carefully. The mud was soft. The combined tracks left deep ruts. He finished 2 fields, 95 acres, by October 2nd. On October 3rd, he started on the southeast section, the lodged corn. The head couldn't pick it up cleanly. Half the ears stayed on the ground. The ones the head did pick up were caked in mud, which clogged the feeder house and slowed the rotor. Harlan combined for 3 hours and covered 4 acres. He shut down, climbed out of the cab, and walked the field. There were ears everywhere, half buried in mud, too low to retrieve. He estimated he was losing 40% of the yield to ground loss. He went home. Over the next week, Harlan finished combining the lodged section. He salvaged 60% of what should have been there. The total loss came to 83 acres worth of corn that either stayed on the ground or was too damaged to sell at full grade. At $2.40 per bushel and an average yield of 145 bushels per acre, the loss was $28,878. Harlan finished the harvest on October 9th. He cleaned the combine, greased it, and parked it in the shed. He did not call Elkhorn Implement. He did not file a complaint with Case IH. He did not mention the 11-day parts delay to anyone except Eleanor, and only once, on the evening of October 9th, when she asked how bad the loss had been. He told her the number. She asked if he was going to say something to the dealer. He said no. She asked why. He said because it wouldn't change what happened. In November, Harlan received the annual lease renewal notice from Gordon Klemp. The notice was the same as it had been for 11 years. 600 acres at $72 per acre, $43,200 due December 15th, renewable for 1994 unless either party provided written notice of termination by December 1st. Harlan sat at the kitchen table with the notice in front of him and ran the numbers he'd been running since October 9th. The harvest loss had been $28,878. His total operating profit for 1993, after expenses and Boer's own labor, was $37,100. The loss had reduced his margin to $8,222, which was not enough to justify the risk of continuing to lease 600 acres at a rate that, while below market, was still $43,200 per year. If Gordon raised the rate to market average, which was $94 per acre, the lease cost would jump to $56,400, an increase of $13,200. Harlan's margin couldn't absorb that. Even if Gordon kept the rate at $72, Harlan's margin was too thin to survive another bad year. Harlan had been farming for 39 years. He was 61 years old. His daughters were grown, both married, neither interested in farming. He had no succession plan. He had been planning to farm another 10 years until he was 71, and then sell the equipment and retire on the equity from his 280 owned acres. But the plan required consistent margins, and 1993 had broken the consistency. Harlan looked at the lease renewal notice and made a decision that had nothing to do with the feeder house chain or the 11-day parts delay or the lodged corn, except that all of those things had produced the $28,878 loss that had reduced his margin to $8,222, which was the number that made the decision inevitable. On November 28, 1993, Harlan Voss mailed a letter to Gordon Klemp giving written notice that he would not be renewing the 600-acre lease for 1994. The letter was polite and brief. It thanked Gordon for 11 years of fair terms and explained that Harlan was scaling back his operation. It did not mention the harvest loss. It did not mention the parts delay. Gordon called 3 days later and asked if there was a problem. Harlan said no, just time to slow down. Gordon asked if Harlan would reconsider. Harlan said no. Gordon said he understood and wished Harlan well. The call lasted less than 3 minutes. In December 1993, Gordon Klemp leased the 600 acres to a younger farmer named Troy Bennington for $94 per acre, the going rate. Troy farmed the land for the next 18 years. In 2011, he bought it from Gordon's estate for $4,200 per acre, $2.52 million total. Harlan heard about the sale from a neighbor. He did not comment on it. He did not calculate what the land might have been worth if he'd been able to hold the lease and eventually buy it himself. Though the calculation was simple, 600 acres at $4,200 per acre was $2.52 million in equity he never had the chance to build. Between 1994 and 2003, Harlan farmed his 280 owned acres alone. He sold the Case IH 1680 axial flow in 1995 and bought a smaller used combine, a 1460, that was adequate for 280 acres. He sold his larger tractor and bought a smaller one. He scaled everything down to match the reduced acreage. His annual operating profit averaged $18,000, which was enough to cover living expenses, but not enough to save for retirement. In 1998, Eleanor was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's. She declined slowly over the next 4 years. Harlan cared for her at home as long as he could. In 2002, he placed her in a memory care facility in Fremont. The cost was $4,100 per month. Harlan sold 80 acres of his land in 2003 to pay for her care. She died in 2005. Harlan was 73 years old. In 2006, Harlan listed his remaining 200 acres for sale. The asking price was $3,800 per acre, $760,000 total. The land sold in 2007 for $3,600 per acre, $720,000. After paying off the remaining mortgage balance and covering the realtor's commission, Harlan cleared $683,000. He moved into a small house in Fremont. He lived on Social Security and the interest from his savings. He did not farm again. Harlan Voss died in January 2019 at the age of 87. His obituary in the Fremont Tribune listed his survivors, 2 daughters and 5 grandchildren, and noted that he had been a lifelong farmer in Dodge County. It did not mention the 600 acres he had leased for 11 years. It did not mention the Case IH 1680 or the feeder house chain or the 11-day parts delay. It did not mention the $28,878 harvest loss or the lease he did not renew or the land he did not buy. None of those things were remarkable enough to include in an obituary. They were just farming. But the 11 days between September 19th and September 30th, 1993, had reshaped the final 26 years of Harlan Voss's life in ways that no one except Harlan ever fully understood. The parts delay had not caused the harvest loss by itself. The wind had done that. The rain had done that. But the delay had positioned Harlan exactly wrong for the weather, and the weather had produced the loss, and the loss had reduced the margin, and the margin had determined the lease decision, and the lease decision had eliminated the path to land ownership, and the eliminated path had compressed Harlan's operation, and the compressed operation had reduced his retirement equity, and the reduced equity had limited his options when Eleanor got sick, and the limited options had required him to sell land he'd planned to keep, and the sold land had reduced his final payout, and the reduced payout had defined his retirement, and his retirement had been smaller and shorter and more isolated than it would have been if the sprocket had been in stock on September 19th, 1993. Harlan never said this out loud. He never calculated it on paper. He never blamed Elkhorn Implement or Dennis Roth or Case IH's backorder system. He just lived with it. And the living with it was quiet and unremarkable and invisible to everyone except the man doing it, which is how most consequences work when they arrive slowly enough that no one thinks to connect them to the decision that started them. Dennis Roth retired from Elkhorn Implement in 2008. He had worked in the parts department for 29 years. When people asked him if he remembered any particular parts orders from all those years, he said no, they all blended together. He did not remember Harlan Voss. He did not remember the feeder house sprocket that was on back order for 11 days in September 1993. There was no reason he would. It was just a parts order. It arrived. The customer picked it up. That was the end of it, as far as Dennis knew. Elkhorn Implement closed in 2014. The building was sold to an auto parts distributor. The Case IH franchise moved to a dealer 22 miles south. Gordon Klemp died in 2010. His estate sold the 600 acres to Troy Bennington for $4,200 per acre. Troy still farms it. The land is worth approximately $7,800 per acre now, as of 2024. If Harlan had been able to hold the lease and buy the land in 2010, the equity would be worth $4.68 million. He cleared $683,000 from the sale of his 200 acres in 2007. The difference was $3,997 million. The difference was the cost of 11 days. Eleanor Voss's memory care facility closed in 2018. The building is now a senior apartment complex. The 80 acres Harlan sold in 2003 to pay for her care are owned by a farming corporation based in Iowa. They are farmed as part of a 4,200-acre operation. The corn yields average 195 bushels per acre. The corporation does not know who Harlan Voss was. There is no reason they would. The Case IH 1680 axial flow that Harlan sold in 1995 is still running. It was bought by a farmer in South Dakota who used it until 2004, then sold it to a farmer in Kansas who used it until 2016, then sold it to a custom harvester who still uses it. The feeder house chain and sprocket that were installed in September 1993 lasted until 2001, when they were replaced during a scheduled maintenance interval. The combine has 8,940 separator hours on it now. It has never had another parts delay longer than 3 days. In 2015, a farm equipment industry analyst published a study on parts supply chain efficiency in the Midwest. One of the findings was that the average backorder delay for Case IH parts in the 1990s was 6.3 days. The study noted that delays beyond 10 days were statistically rare, occurring in approximately 4% of all parts orders. The study did not name individual dealers. It did not name individual customers. It just reported the numbers. Harlan Voss's 11-day delay in September 1993 was part of the 4%. He never knew that. It would not have changed anything if he had. There is a specific kind of farming story that no one tells because it doesn't fit the shape of stories people expect. It has no villain. It has no confrontation. It has no moment of dramatic reversal. It is just a man standing in a parts department on a Tuesday afternoon in September, waiting for a part that is on back order, and then going home and waiting some more, and then installing the part when it finally arrives, and then combining the fields that are left to combine, and then running the numbers in November, and then making the only decision the numbers allow, and then living with that decision for the next 26 years, without complaint and without explanation, and without any expectation that anyone would understand what the decision had cost. Because understanding requires tracking a consequence across decades, and most people can't track a consequence across a week. Harlan Voss tracked it. He didn't talk about it, but he tracked it. He knew exactly what September 1993 had cost him. Not in the immediate loss of $28,878, but in the long elimination of the path he'd been on before the feeder house chain broke. He knew it when he signed the lease termination letter in November 1993. He knew it when he sold the 1680 in 1995. He knew it when he sold 80 acres in 2003. He knew it when he sold the remaining 200 acres in 2007. He knew it when he moved into the small house in Fremont. He knew it every year he didn't farm the 600 acres and didn't buy the 600 acres and didn't build the equity the 600 acres would have given him. He carried that knowledge the way farmers carry most knowledge about what their decisions cost, quietly, privately, and without any expectation that carrying it will change what it weighs. The parts delay did not create the harvest loss. The weather created the harvest loss. But the parts delay positioned Harlan exactly wrong for the weather. And being positioned exactly wrong was the same as being wrong. And being wrong in September cost him everything that came after September, which was 26 years of living smaller than he'd planned to live, retiring poorer than he'd planned to retire, and watching other people farm the land he'd cared for and couldn't keep. The feeder house chain that broke on September 19, 1993, cost Harlan Voss $47 in parts. The sprocket cost $123. The 11-day delay cost him nothing that anyone at Elkhorn Implement recorded. And that is how a $170 parts order became a $3.997 million consequence that no one except the man who lived it ever connected to the moment it started.